This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. Many years ago, when I was in high school, played football. I was never a great football player, but I was like second tier, I guess. I had an opportunity to attend Service Academy, two of them, Naval Academy and West Point. VMI, they'd reached out to me, and Citadel. I was a linebacker. I was never like, top tier, but I didn't mind getting hit. And that's what happens when you play football. It's like going through a car accident every single day that you go to practice. Practice for me was always worse than games. But my football career came to an end as a result of a car accident that I was in. And a guy ran a red light, and I had this beautiful 1968 Mustang that had been restored. 3-speed transmission. Love that car. And I was actually on a way to a Key Club meeting in high school. And the guy blew the light. He was driving a Ford pickup truck, and he had 5 people in the front seat on a bench seat in this thing. And hits me in the front right quarter panel of my car. I had the right of way. It's 4-lane street. I was going green. He blew the light, hit me. And I wound up being in a hospital for about a month, lost the sensation on the left side of my body. I hurt my C5, C4. And eventually, through traction, those sorts of things, they relieved that problem. But I've never completely recovered from that. My neck still cracks. It still hurts. And my pride hurts too, because I always think about what if, Well, what I went through that day is something that I'm sure that many of you guys have gone through throughout your lives. And that is being involved in a motor vehicle accident. Now, you can bear witness to them, and that's terrifying enough. But, when you're suddenly rear-ended or somebody just comes out of nowhere and hammers you, it's one of the most terrifying experiences of your life, because you're at the mercy of a machine at that point in time. And all of that energy is transferred into your body. Well, today we're going to talk about that energy transfer. And we're going to talk about it in various modalities. But the theme today on Body Bags is going to be blunt force trauma. And I think it's going to make for an interesting conversation. And I'm hoping that you'll learn something along the way. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Brother Dave, I was on the same defense in high school as Jesse Tuggle was.
Oh, wow.
Jesse Tuggle is the career-leading tackler in NFL history.
Yep.
They called him the Hammer. Played his entire career as a walk-on, by the way, as a free agent, a walk-on in college, and as a free agent. He was non-drafted and wound up being, and I've never been hit so hard in my life when I was hit by Jesse Tuggle. Sweet guy. But he's the only person I ever saw, talk about blunt force trauma. He's the only guy I ever saw in football and he played defensive end in high school, that actually caved another person's face mask in with a single blow from his forearm.
Wow.
A Rydell face mask that had the center bar that ran right, and it actually bent and cut the guy's nose. I'd never seen that before. That's the kind of power he had. And he never... He was one of these guys, kind of like Herschel Walker, that never dedicated himself to the weight room.
Right.
He's just naturally strong.
Wow.
And a force of nature. He's kind of like getting hit by a Ford F-150.
I was looking over the list of blunt force deaths, because as we were talking about doing this show, I realized how ignorant, and I mean that, unknowing of what that is. And looking at some of the pictures of the different aspects of blunt force trauma. I've learned so many things from you doing this show. And I thought, what are the most common modes of blunt force death? If you have to, is there like a graph anywhere where you can look at these and go, yeah, here's the one?
Yeah, you could probably dig it up. I'm going to go ahead and give it away right now. The number one source of fatal blunt force trauma in America, and I would probably say in the world, are motor vehicle accidents.
Okay,
people always talk about gun violence and all these things, and yeah, it's real, it's out there, but nothing comes close to motor vehicle accidents, particularly in America.
Have you been in more accidents than the one you talked about?
Let's see. Yeah, I've been rear-ended a couple of times, but never anything other than that was so traumatic. And listen, I've had as a practitioner, I've had multiple car accidents that I've worked, not just car on car, but pedestrian on car, or car on pedestrian, which is horrible. I actually, and even as a professor, I actually had a kid that was hit in a crosswalk on the way to my lecture, right in front of the campus. And this was when I was over in Georgia teaching. And one of their colleagues, one of their fellow students came up in the class and said, "Hey, Professor Morgan, so-and-so has been hit. They're on the way to the hospital." And sure enough, I looked out in my classroom window, I could see the flashing lights. Yeah, I felt a little guilty because I was back then. I was very stringent about showing up on time.
Did you give him a 0 for the day?
I'm not that brutal, but they were probably sprinting and not paying attention to the crosswalk.
JSM's going to get me, man. I got to hurry.
No, I'm not that cruel of a teacher, but yeah, and most of the time, if you have car versus pedestrian, it goes without saying, car is going to win every single time. And you can sustain blunt force trauma in motor vehicle accidents in any number of ways. And let me just kind of tell you how this breaks down, because it's kind of interesting, particularly from just a physics standpoint. Let's say an individual is traveling down the road and they're riding in their motor vehicle. Well, let's say they are struck head on by another approaching vehicle. Well, the vehicle, or they hit a fixed object, the vehicle that they're traveling in is going to come to a dead stop, theoretically. Okay. Well, not everything in the vehicle comes to a dead stop. All right. Because just because you're anchored with a safety belt, or just because an airbag deploys, you still have this energy that is going to be transferred from that impact. And as the car comes to a dead stop, your body, for that moment in time, is still traveling. Let's just pick a number. Let's say still traveling at 45 miles per hour. The head-on collision may have taken place at 45 miles per hour. And your body is still traveling through space at that point. And, the seatbelt catches you. I've had people that have been killed by their seatbelts, Dave. And one of the main things that happens, just to give you a sense for this, if people will take you can use your left or your right hand and find your sternum and move it about, go kind of high up on your sternum and just below about 2 inches below your collarbone, your left collarbone, and go down about 2 inches. Stop right there, just to the side of your sternum. That's where your aorta sits. And your aorta is like the major gigantic vessel that comes off of your heart. And that's where, like oxygenated blood is pumped through that. It runs all the way down your spine. It bifurcates, comes into your femoral arteries. It goes up and transfers out to your arm through your brachial arteries. It's a major source. So what happens is, Dave, that arch, it's the aortic arch, is so fragile. So when your body stops, guess what? Your internal organs are still moving. People don't think about that. Your internal organs are still moving. Like, your body doesn't, the shell of your body might cease motion, but for a millisecond, the organs within your body are actually still traveling. I've had cases over the course of my career where the heart will slam up against the backside of the sternum. And when that happens, the aorta will tear and there's a very fragile area where it's kind of the root of the aorta where it comes off of the heart. And it literally, and look it up, just do a Google search on aortic arch and you'll see it. It's curved. There's a real fragile area right there where it kind of roots off of the heart and begins its downward descent. And you get these little rips in it. And let me tell you something, even if you've got a team of cardiothoracic surgeons that are standing right there, there's a high probability they're not going to save you. All right. And so you're going to bleed out. And that's as a result of blunt force trauma. You have cardiac contusions where you'll have, the heart slam up against the chest wall. I've seen that. You get what's called a cardiac tamponade, where the pericardial sac will tear. It's this, for lack of a better term, it is a sac that your heart is encased in. At autopsy, we have to cut this thing open, and it's filled with cardiac fluid in there. It kind of bathes the heart. And when that is compromised, the sac fills up with blood, and it compromises the heart's ability to beat. So you've got all of this stuff. Another fragile organ in your body that is, I was going to say impacted, which is kind of accurate, is the liver and the spleen as well, because they will slam forward. Liver, when you get a rip in the liver, physicians, particularly, I can't speak to any other physicians, but forensic pathologists, they refer to those as liver fractures. And you think about fracture relative to the bone, but when you look at the surface of the liver, it'll have this kind of irregular, jagged kind of tear in it. And they'll call that a hepatic fracture many times, and it rips open. And buddy, if your liver splits like that, your gut's going to fill up with blood. Spleen is very fragile. You'll have that. My favorite aunt in the world died as a result of a car accident. She got T-boned. The thing that killed her, she got hit on the driver's side of her door in her Chrysler Imperial. It's like a 1974 Chrysler Imperial. You could put 8 bodies in the trunk of this thing. And my Aunt Roxy, that was her name, she died as a result of 3 of her ribs on the left side being fractured and driven into her lung. Lung deflates, chest fills up with blood. They put a chest tube in. She lasted for maybe 2 or 3 days, but she was older. You can't recover from that sort of thing. So you get all of these types of injuries that arise from the number one source of blunt force trauma that we experience in America, and that's motor vehicle accidents. That's why they try to make motor vehicles safer than they used to be. Many times, and people really take exception when you start to talk about this sort of thing, many times, and I know seat belts save lives. How many times have we heard that over the years? And that's all fine and good. And yeah, they do. But in my world, we see seatbelt injuries. You'll have these big diagonal marks that run from the apex of the right shoulder all the way down to like your left iliac crest, which is, where your pelvis is on the left side of your hip there. And you'll have this big, nasty, abraded area that runs through there. And it's, that's where that locking mechanism kicks in with the seatbelt and your body stops and you kind of fold like in this weird way. If you could see it in slow motion, it's kind of ghastly to watch. And if you go back, when I first started my career, you had shoulder belts, but the majority of people still had lap belts in their cars. Well, that energy transfer with lap belts, you remember, people never wore lap belts. People didn't wear safety belts. And people that did wear lap belts, when they would hit a fixed object, this is so gruesome. It's one of the most gruesome injuries you can sustain. There's like a cluster of these things, pelvic fractures. And so when the pelvis fractures, which is horrific in and of itself. I got a great story about when I worked as an ER tech setting a fractured pelvis on a 12-year-old boy that had slid into home plate. Catcher fell. He impacted the catcher and fractured this kid's pelvis. The pelvis would fracture. And if I talked about the femoral arteries that run through the floor of the pelvis. There's these holes in bone are referred to as foramen. And so there's these little foramen that these vessels run through. And if any of those are fractured, in any way, they create these sharp edges, and you can, those vessels are severed. And again, they're hard to get to dig into, to try to tie them off. People bleed out, from that. And I haven't even touched on, what happens to the brain, because again, you're in motion, and your brain is encased in this rock hard, bony, I don't know, vault. It's called the cranial vault. Not a lot of cushion. Your brain is surrounded. It's actually contained in a sac as well within your brain. It's called the dura, and it's bathed in cerebral spinal fluid, and it's supposed to act as a kind of a shock absorber. And if you ever see the inside of a skull, it's got these really nasty kind of, undulations in it and that sort of thing. So when the brain, if you didn't have that cushion in there, we'd have a lot more people dead. But if you get hit from the side, you have an initial energy transfer, and these are called coup and contra coup injuries, where the brain will, if you're hit from the left side, well, the brain, let me get this straight. So your head, in reaction to being struck on the left side, will go to the left, but your brain is traveling to the right. Okay. And as you come back, the brain is traveling from the right to the left. So it'll slam up against both of those walls. And you get these big indwelling subdural, subarachnoid hemorrhages that are in there, and you begin to bleed out in your brain. And those little vessels in there can get clipped. There's so many things that can happen to you in a car accident that it's quite striking on one level. Remember when we did the episode, and I recommend anybody that hasn't, we did an episode on sharp force injuries very recently. Mm-hmm. And I talked about people being impaled in sharp force injuries. You have objects that come through cars, that sort of thing. And again, those are puncture wounds. But, you've also got items that are in cars, okay? And they're not buckled down. So let's say you're traveling down the road, and in your back window, your kid at Vacation Bible School painted you a stone to use as a doorstop, and it's in the back window. Well, there's certain ways you can be hit in that car, and that stone that's free floating, or it's not anchored down in the car, suddenly becomes a projectile in that environment. That's why if you see, have you ever seen delivery trucks, Dave, that like vans that have that screen that's between the front two seats in the van? Right. It's a metal screen. Well, there's a reason they have the metal screen. It's not to I guess they have them in prison vans, but there's a reason that companies have been encouraged by insurance companies to put these things in, because anything that's being carried in the back suddenly becomes a projectile and it's flying through the air. So you can be impacted that way too, Dave. Well, Dave, some of the most brutal cases I've ever worked were resulting from blunt force trauma within a household. We talk a lot about knives, but knives are in a sense are weapons of convenience, because you can walk into the kitchen and maybe if your dishes are clean and you've put them away, you might run across a knife. But with blunt force trauma, those are what we refer to many times in homes as weapons of convenience. And, it reminds me of the game Clue. And I got to give you an insight. I think I've said this before. I've never won a game of Clue, and I'm a forensics guy. I don't do
Colonel
well with
Mustard
board games.
Did it in the library with a lead pipe.
With a lead pipe. There's a candle holder. There's all these other things that are out there, that can be utilized. And what's fascinating to me scientifically is that when you begin to examine a body that has been subjected to blunt force trauma, all of these instruments, particularly weapons of convenience, you can actually see a pattern that develops that is unique to that item. For instance, if you have a pipe, okay, that has a threaded end on it, and someone is struck with that pipe, you can see the impression of the threads from the pipe, particularly how much force, and you know what those threads are, how they're being displayed. Well, they're being displayed actually, Dave, through an abrasion, because abrasions come up, and we can all identify with abrasions. So I would submit to you that everybody has sustained a blunt force trauma at some point in time in your life. Even when you were a little kid, if you fall down on the ground and go boom, if you have had a skinned knee, a skinned elbow, skinned shoulder, nose, whatever it is, that is evidence of blunt force trauma. And what happens is those abraded areas that you see, the skin is literally being kind of plowed through at a very superficial level. And that top layer of skin down to the derm, you peel back that epidermis, you've got the dermis, it's going to hemorrhage, and it's going to hemorrhage slightly. That's why it has that red discoloration. It begins to dry out after. Sometimes you'll get a scab on it, that sort of thing. Well, that's kind of the superficial level if you're at the top end. It depended upon how much force is behind that strike, that will travel down through the dermis and into what's called the subcu fat, that kind of cushioned area that protects the outside of our body and overlies the musculature. And so with that depth, you're going deeper and deeper and deeper, depending upon how much force is applied. And also, Dave, how many times they've been struck. And I got to tell you the story. All right. Wow. About the worst.
It never occurred to me, you know, that you would have to figure out how many times how many times somebody got hit.
Oh yeah, you do. And you try to figure out, and again, full disclosure here, I have to say that you can never ever determine order most of the time, except in the case I'm about to tell you about. And it's probably one of the most gut-wrenching things I've ever worked. I had a case in Atlanta of a lady that lived in public housing, and she lived there, I'm doing air quotes right now, with her boyfriend. I love it when they're referred to as a fiance. They've been a fiance for like the last decade.
Right.
Well, he's like a raging, angry alcoholic, and his fiance is suffering from all kinds of debilitating physical problems.
Mm-hmm.
They had a studio apartment in public housing. I'd never seen one of these before. And she slept on the pull-out sofa in the front room of the house. And she was always covered in blankets. And she couldn't move. She had diabetes. She had a partial amputation of one of her feet, heart disease. I mean, the list just goes on and on. So, he's what's referred to as a mean drunk. Well, I got called out in Atlanta. This radio signal for a death is 48. So they call it a signal 48. And it came out initially as a 48 natural is the way that the radio call. But she's found dead. So I'm mandated to have to go out to the scene just to examine her. And I roll out there, and I'm met by a young uniformed officer and this male that's hanging outside. And he is hammered. And there are these cans of beer that each individually, they're big malt liquor cans that are still wrapped in paper bags, empty, but they're laying all over the place and sitting up on the stairs. And when he greeted me, he's like, "Hey, Cap, how you doing?" And so for me, and I had police officers that were telling me that if someone calls you Cap, and I'm wearing a badge, they call you Cap, there's a high probability they've done time, because it's like a formal address, "Hey, Captain," like Captain of the Guard and that sort of thing. And I said, "Hey, how are you?" And I didn't want to talk to him at that point. I just wanted to go in and see this lady's body. Well, the young officer followed me in and said, yeah, he came home. He's been out all night. He came home and found her dead in the bed. And it was hot. I mean, it was so hot in this apartment. And she's covered in like 3 layers of blankets. Well, I'm looking at her. I pull the blankets back, Dave, and she's got this dirty nightgown on. And when you pull the blanket back, the smell just kind of rushes out and hits you. And it's not decomp. It's a smell of feces. It's a smell of urine. It's kind of stale urine smell. And as it turned out, it was also a smell of bed sores.
Oh, my.
And so I began to examine her. And Dave, when I pulled back these blankets and pulled up her this dirty, filthy nightgown that she had on, Dave, she had all of these contusions, which, remember, it goes abrasion, then contusion. So contusion is deep tissue. It's a bruise. It's a fancy term for a bruise. So you have to get past the abrasion. 167 of them.
Oh, my.
167 of them. The reason I know that is they were in this odd shape. They were shaped. See, how can I describe it? They were each one of them was about an inch in width. They had it almost looked like a sawtooth end at the terminal end of each one of them. And I say sawtooth, kind of jagged. And each one of them varied in length from about 12 inches up to about 16 inches. She was covered with them, Dave. And when I saw that, I looked at that officer. I said, put his ass in handcuffs, put him in the back of the unit out there, call detectives, get CID en route. I've got to call back to my office. Call back to my office because I'd never seen anything like this. And when I'm describing this, I get the pathologist that happened to be a friend of mine that was on duty. I said, look, man, I've never seen this. I would really prefer that you come here. He's like, come pick me up. And we were not that far away from the office. I ran, blasted over the office, grabbed him. We came back. And I'll never forget this friend of mine who's from North Dakota, and he's got this real thick North Dakota accent. He's like, oh my, like that. And he said, we've got to get her under good lighting so I can better examine her. And took her back, and I was with him in the morgue, and I suited up for this, and we start taking photos of these injuries all over her body, Dave. And they were mostly anterior on the front of her body because she was bedridden and laid in one spot. She had these big ulcerated bed sores. It was 167 of them. And the physician looked at me and said, there is something in that house that matches this pattern. You got to go find it. So myself and the homicide detectives went back out there, and in their laundry room, Dave, there's a shelf over, and people can identify, the shelf that you have over where you keep your detergent and your fabric softener and all that. And I started moving things around, and in the back, behind like where the detergent was, there was a busted or fractured dryer belt. Now, if you've never seen a dryer belt, they're actually more robust than car fan belts. They're big in diameter. And sure enough, Dave, the thing matched the pattern on the end of this thing, that every time he came home, blistered drunk, he would grab this thing, and this poor woman who's so debilitated is completely dependent upon her fiance. He would beat her every single time. This is a first for me. When we were in the morgue, have you ever heard the old term beaten to a pulp?
Mm-hmm.
When the physician, because we were trying to age, what they call age the wounds or age the bruises, contusions, you create these external incisions just to go down specifically into that area. She had been beaten so ferociously, Dave, that her sub-Q fat in many spots had liquefied. And when the incision was made, it, along with blood, came pouring out. Look, there are any number of ways that blunt force trauma can be sustained. I'm thinking right now, many times about our elder population. I'm sure that many of us can identify. We've had elderly loved ones that have fallen and, broken a hip, that sort of thing. Our bones are not as robust as they were when we were younger. That's a form of blunt force trauma. And you'll find people that are haven't necessarily had a heart attack, but they're lightheaded. They don't have the same gait that they once did. They're very unsteady, and they can fall and crack their heads. You'll see that many times manifest on scene. And sometimes you see that and you're thinking, oh my Lord, they've been beaten. And that's not the case. But for us in the field, Dave, we look for any manner of injury that we can tie back to a specific object that may have created it.
Wow. Can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
When the Karen Reed trial took up a lot of primetime crime coverage, and there were two of them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the victim, John O'Keefe, kind of got lost in the shuffle between whatever kind of investigation happened and who Karen Reed was or is. And I did look at pictures and things that were made available. You're familiar with the case enough that he suffered blunt force trauma, correct?
Yes, he did. Yeah, he did. And the blunt force trauma that I was particularly focused on in that case was going to be the head trauma, because that, along with hypothermia, is probably what brought about his death.
Okay. That's what I was wondering, because I knew that he was out there in a blizzard, and that had to have some type of an impact, but there had to be something that made him where he couldn't get up and get himself warm. So that's where the head trauma comes in, right? Yeah,
that's where the head trauma comes in. And what was fascinating about that, I remember distinctly looking at the sketch that the forensic pathologist had created with the interior of his skull. And we do these sketches, or we have they're templates that you use in the morgue. Everybody's seen these things. They're kind of, you'll see a man or a woman and you'll have them in anterior view, posterior view. You'll have them in lateral view. Then they do specific close-ups of the body. Like there'll be one completely devoted to the head, one devoted to the hand, and it can be the left or right hand. If you want to get very specific, and they do one where the top of the head, the calvarium, top of the skull, is missing, and you're looking down into the cranial vault. Well, with O'Keefe's, the thing that I noticed about his, it was so very, no pun intended, striking, was the fact that he had two separate groups of fractures. He's got this kind of anterior thing that's going on with the right eye, where that fracture goes through the floor of the skull. Okay. And it ceases before it gets to the foramen magnum, which is where your spinal cord dumps down, where your brainstem turns into your spinal cord. It ended before that, and it's kind of a spider web. It looks like a spider web when you see it. He's got one of those on the backside too. These are two separate events. So you've got an initial impact, boom, being hit. They describe this trauma on the right aspect of his face. And then you've got this strike, and there's this laceration on the backside of his head. Well, when he impacts whatever surface he impacted, if you're particularly hit by a car, that energy transfer is pretty tremendous, Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, he was beaten up by other people and dumped out there. Well, if you say that he was beaten by other people, my question would be, what was he beaten with? Because hands are not going to generate those kind of fractures inside.
Okay.
Maybe, I guess, if he got stomped on, but if somebody gets stomped on, you see a pattern abrasion, on their face.
You would see I would think if it was in a beating, you would see other injuries around the body, because in any fight I've ever seen, people get hit all over the place. You don't get, two or three, you get several.
And one of the more interesting kind of hypotheses that was pushed out there was a head strike, a posterior head strike on the leading edge of a step. And it's because you've got this kind of linear laceration on the backside. And by the way, I'm going to go into this. lacerations are different than cuts. We kind of talked about this in sharp force injury. I hope everybody will go back and listen to that. This is a laceration on the back of his head. That's blunt force trauma. That it's maybe a little bit larger than an inch, and it runs east and west. It's in the horizontal plane, and so that energy from that created this other fracture on the floor of the skull. So when you look at that, you begin to kind of try to assess. And O'Keefe is merely an example of this. In the morgue, we try to assess what instrument could have caused this, and also what instrument could have caused this that would have sufficient force to do this. Okay? Because you're not just going to like fall down and go boom, and you get this kind of complex fracture pattern on the floor of the skull. That's not the way that happens. It's not the way this works. It's not the way how any of this works. All right. It just doesn't. You can go ahead and push that out of your mind. It's so
weird because, Joe, there's things that, that people like me, I have no clue. Okay. I see things a certain way, but then when I'm talking to you and you start explaining how these things look, I'm thinking, how does anybody ever get away with anything? I mean that because you look at something so different than the way most people do.
Well, and that's a good question. I don't know. The way people get away with things, and I know I have missed things personally, and that's the way you become a better investigator. Is not through success, but through failure.
Yeah.
It all depends on how much. It's generally some kind of human error where you miss something. And going back to the O'Keefe scene, so much was lost in that period of time, the way it was handled, the way people responded to it. And look, there'll be people that will be lecturing about that case for years and years to come. I mean, it's done and finished now, except so
Karen Reed cannot be tried again. She was judged not guilty.
Yeah, precisely. Now it's going to be a liability phase where you're going to go in civil court. And that might be a bit of a different
lower threshold of proof there.
It's preponderance of the evidence. I guess if Nancy was here, she'd say, "Are you a lawyer, Joe Scott?"
I know.
No, I'm not, but I've sat through enough depositions I've sat through enough depositions to know. But you can look at that. You can look at that and try to understand, how this would have happened. You try to explain it, and all you can do is give that information back to the police that are trying to understand the circumstances. And that's where the circumstantial evidence, you present them with the physical findings, that you have there, provided that the information that was gleaned at the scene is sufficient to the task. Because sometimes in our world, you don't necessarily have all the data that's coming in.
Well, and you and I've noticed that in covering stories where there will, I'll give you like Harmony Montgomery comes to mind.
Oh, God.
Where we had a lot of information on that story as it was, because it came in late and we were figuring out. And I remember you and I were talking about it and more information came out. And it was like, wait a minute, that explains so much, something small.
Yeah.
And it basically for you could break the case wide open because you knew based on all of the information you had on the physical evidence of what we had at that point, that even without a body, based on what you were told, you were able to figure out what happened.
Well, yeah. And with that, he and father, with that person, even he infamously said, I think I really hit her hard this time.
Yeah.
And that precious baby, died in the back seat of a convertible Sebring in the dead of winter in our Northeast. Great job of providing such a wonderful life for that little angel. And, still to this day, but, we know that he had struck her on various occasions. And I felt like, and poor angel, she's blind anyway, Dave. Remember that? She's blind. She has to wear glasses.
I know.
What a struggle. All I
could think of was anybody that saw that case.
Yeah.
I just remember thinking, why? Come on, I would have taken her. You know?
Just, no questions asked. Just bring her to my doorstep. You know what I'm saying? Or we'll find somebody. And, this had been a progression, and that goes into also assessment of blunt force trauma, because Dave, in our world, in the world of death investigation, and also with child abuse cases, Dave, what kind of happens is we actually grade bruises, and it's when you're working as a child abuse investigator, which God bless those people that do that job. I don't know how in the world they could do it, but I think that everybody that's hearing me right now can understand this. Let me kind of run down the time frame so that everybody understands about blunt force trauma. And one of the things we look at, not only in the morgue, but when you have a social worker or a physician that's working for law enforcement that's assessing child abuse cases, one of the things they do is they will age bruises. And just give me a little latitude here and let me break it down. So when you initially get a contusion or an impact injury, you're going to be looking at the surface of the skin will be kind of red. It's like that irritation. Remember how I talked about with an abrasion, anything that makes contact with the skin, even a closed fist, it'll have that kind of red discoloration. And you'll see that in the immediate. Then it'll take about 1 to 4 hours and you'll begin to see blue and purple, okay, in the color. Just think about this on your own body, Generally about 4 days downrange, that purplish area will begin to turn that creepy green color, okay? And that's going to last about 4 to 7 days. Then you're going to get the really disgusting color, which is yellow. And that's just part of the healing process. And that's the blood that's contained in that contused area that is resolving. All right. It's kind of dissipating because it's often interstitial tissue. You got broken vessels. The vessels are healing, and that blood just kind of, it disappears over a period of time. Well, the yellow will stay around 7 to 10 days. And then after about 14 to 21 days, you're back to normal. You say, Morgan, what difference does that make? I'll tell you what difference it makes. If you've got an ongoing case of abuse, all right, if you're interviewing a child, and I'm talking now to people that deal with the living, they will have that child assessed by maybe a nurse practitioner or maybe even a physician. And if they notice that you have bruises on a body that are in these different states of healing, they're going to know that this is, Dave, not a one-off event. Okay, I can't tell you how many of these cases I've worked over the years where you'll have an individual that is, their little bodies are just littered with contusions. And you'll have the suspect that will say, well, oh yeah, well, they fell down the stairs. My next question is, how many times and what days did they fall down the stairs? Because of those color changes, that these are not one-off events. You'll have these layered things. It's kind of like the woman that I was mentioning that was beaten to death with the dryer belt over and over and over again. And these things are layered on top of one another. So it's very important for us to be able to assess these injuries, to contextualize it relative to what's going on. And again, with her, one of the things that we're looking at is what's referred to as pattern impact trauma. What could have generated it? We were talking about baseball bats just a minute ago, and let me tell you how this kind of breaks down. You'll find this fascinating. Have you ever seen the super slow-mo shots of a baseball being struck by a bat where it's going through the strike zone? And the ball, you can see just for a millisecond, the ball bends. It literally bends and wraps, particularly with an aluminum bat or metal bat. It'll wrap just for a second. You'll see an indentation. Do you know our skin works the same way? So if somebody gets struck in the arm with like a baseball bat or any solid object, for an instant, the skin will wrap around the circumference, let's say it's a cylindrical object, around the circumference of it, and then pop back into place after being struck. So that's why many times these contusions actually appear a bit larger than the actual instrument that generated it. So if somebody's struck with a barrel of a bat, right in the sweet spot, as you guys call it, right in the sweet spot of the bat, that contusion is going to have the appearance of a much larger object. But what's happening is that central point of impact is, hang on, I'm showing Dave, I got to demonstrate to him that I know how to roll my wrist. So as you roll your wrist through the swing, the tissue will wrap around the barrel of the bat. So even something that's not directly struck will slap that outer portion of the bat, and you'll get this real broad-ranging contusion. And that's one of the things you kind of assess. Now, if you're using something like a hammer, because we have people that have hammer attacks where they're struck, it's not necessarily the same shape. What's fascinating with like hammer attacks and blunt force trauma is that if someone is struck in the skull, you'll have a coin shape. If you're thinking about standard finishing hammer, a coin shape abraded area in the skin. And then when you reflect the scalp, you'll have these perfect plugged areas of fracture. And it's a circular fracture, which you don't see a lot in the skull. And these things, many times what happens is that as the skull, the external table of the skull is fractured away from those anchor points around it structurally, that it's not the hammer being driven into the brain. It's actually that plug of bone that's being driven into the brain. So you've got this layered event, and you get multiple of these. The skin is not necessarily going to appear the same either. We've got all over the body, and surgeons know this, we have what are referred to as lines of Langer. And if people are out there that have been in the military, one of the first things they teach you to do in the military is to study contour maps. And it gives you height, elevation, that sort of thing. So the tighter those lines with elevation, they follow the pattern of the ground. Well, we have those patterns all over our body, and they're very predictable. As a matter of fact, when med school students are studying human anatomy, they learn the lines of Langer. So if you make an incision, like classic incision everybody's familiar with is what's referred to as the McBurney incision, and that's for an appendectomy. For years, people, it wasn't always done laparoscopically where they're going to go through your belly button. They make this diagonal scar. It's on the right lower quadrant of your abdomen, and it runs diagonally opposing to where the actual appendix is. The reason they make that incision that way is because it follows the line of Langer. Essentially, like if you're talking about furniture, it follows the grain. So if you cut across the lines of Langer, it opens up into this really ghastly injury, okay? Well, when you have someone struck by an instrument, okay, like a bat or a hammer or whatever it is, a car, they get these big, nasty lacerations that are abnormal in appearance. The sides don't appear to marry up. You really have to like in the morgue, we'll use tape many times, and we'll use really strong medical tape to try to pull the sides together just so that we can appreciate how the two things connect. Because when you take the tape off, it's just going to spring back out to this real irregular, I don't know, the best way I can say it is like a Frankenstein, cut, because it's so odd when you see it. And you know that you're dealing, because that's a true laceration, you'll have these little bits of skin that attach to either side. That's called tissue bridging. So it's not completely cut through. So you're going to see that with blunt force trauma in particular. So I would say, Dave, that compared to gunshot wounds and anything I ever had to assess in the medical legal context, blunt force trauma by far is the most difficult thing to assess, make a record of, to try to connect with some specific object that's out there. It takes time. Everything that we assess takes time. There's a learning curve with it. But I still, to this day, at this age and stage in my life, there's still things daily that I can learn about blunt force trauma and the scars that are left behind. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.